Winter had buried more than the earth. In his empty hands, Thomas could still feel Elizabeth's last breath. Rain beat against the window panes like his tears against the ground. Then she appeared, Catherine, with eyes that held the same sky but different light. Between shared silences and hands that found each other timidly by the fire, pain transformed into something new. Can a broken heart beat again with the same strength? In the Colorado mountains, two wounded souls discover that some endings are, in reality, disguised beginnings. If this story touched your heart, leave us your like as one who holds the hand of someone learning to walk again. And now I ask you, how do you think this story of loss and rebirth will end? Share your voice in the comments, because every scar hides a story that deserves to be told. The already yellowed envelope trembled between her fingers like an autumn leaf. Catherine Harding felt the weight of the paper as if it were lead, while her eyes ran over and over those lines traced by an unknown hand, but speaking of someone so close. The ink, slightly faded from the journey from Colorado to Boston, told of the inevitable. Elizabeth, her younger sister, had succumbed to the flu epidemic ravaging the West. The room in her small teacher's apartment suddenly seemed narrower, colder. The pale May light filtered through the window, drawing patterns on the wooden floor that Catherine no longer saw. Only the words of that man existed, Thomas Whitaker, Elizabeth's husband, describing with painful precision her sister's last moments. In her final moments, he wrote, "Elizabeth asked me to tell you the truth, to write to you. She made me promise it." Catherine closed her eyes. The memory of Elizabeth with her singing laugh and golden braids contrasted violently with the image now forming in her mind, a fragile body consumed by fever, buried in strange and distant land. A land Catherine had never set foot on, but that now called to her sister from the depths. Sitting at her desk, surrounded by uncorrected student notebooks, Catherine remembered the promise she had made to Elizabeth 3 years ago, when she departed, westward with that stranger with deep eyes and calloused hands. "If something happens to me," Elizabeth had said, taking her hands, "promise me you'll go, that you'll help him for 3 months, enough time for him to reorganize his life." Catherine had nodded then, convinced she would never have to fulfill such a promise. Now, however, the words weighed like a stone upon her conscience. With trembling fingers, she opened her desk drawer and extracted the small wooden box where she kept her savings. There wasn't much, but it would suffice for the journey. Her gaze fell upon the calendar. School would end in 2 weeks. She could leave then. While contemplating the void, Catherine felt a strange determination grow within her. It wasn't just the promise that drove her, but something deeper. The need to connect with Elizabeth's last days, to breathe the same air she had breathed, to know the man who had held her hand while she said goodbye to the world. She took paper and pen. "Dear Mr. Whitaker," she began to write, "I will arrive in Pine Ridge at the end of May." The train advanced lazily through landscapes Catherine had never imagined. The endless plains gradually gave way to rolling hills, and finally, to the imposing mountains that stood out against the horizon like sleeping giants. The land seemed to change character, becoming wilder, more untamed as they moved away from the civilization Catherine knew. The compartment smelled of leather, tobacco, and that peculiar metallic aroma brought by the western wind. Catherine kept her gaze fixed on the window, watching how the towns became smaller and more distant from each other. Each kilometer traveled was another kilometer farther from her ordered life in Boston, from her students, from the library where she spent Sunday afternoons, from the cobblestone streets and gas lamps. She pressed against her chest the small locket containing a strand of Elizabeth's hair. She had carried it as a talisman, as a compass, to guide her on this journey into the unknown. Inside her travel bag, carefully wrapped among her clothes, she also carried the last book they had read together, a volume of poetry with passages underlined by her sister's hand. "Next stop, Junction Creek," announced the conductor, crossing the car with tired steps. Catherine felt her heart accelerate. Junction Creek was the last train stop. From there, according to Thomas Whitaker's directions, she should take a stagecoach. That would take her to Pine Ridge, a 4-hour journey through winding and steep roads. Upon descending from the train, the cold mountain air struck her cheeks like a slap. The station was nothing more than a small wooden construction next to a group of scattered buildings. Men with faces weathered by the sun and women with suspicious looks observed her while she waited for the stagecoach. Her dark and simple dress, her small-brimmed hat, and her gloves immediately identified her as a foreigner. "Are you Miss Harding?" asked a hoarse voice behind her. Catherine turned to find an older man whose face, furrowed with wrinkles, seemed like a map of those harsh lands. "I'm Harrison," the man introduced himself. "I drive the stagecoach to Pine Ridge. Mr. Whitaker asked me to watch for your arrival." While climbing into the rickety stagecoach, Catherine felt an oppression in her chest. The reality of what she was doing, of the life she had temporarily left behind, fell upon her with all its weight. For a moment she considered turning around, returning to the safety of her known existence. But Elizabeth's memory prevailed. She could see her clearly, saying goodbye at the Boston platform, her eyes bright with hope and adventure. "I'm going toward my destiny, Cathy," she had said. Now somehow Catherine was following in her footsteps, even if it was on a different path. The stagecoach began to move, entering an increasingly imposing and solitary landscape. Catherine Harding held onto her seat, while her eyes absorbed every detail of that land that had claimed her sister forever. The cabin stood out against the twilight like a solitary silhouette, barely distinguishable among the pines that surrounded it. As the stagecoach approached, Catherine could make out the thin smoke escaping from the chimney, the only sign of life in that wasteland of silence. Her heart beat strongly under her corset, each pulse a reminder of what she came to seek and what she had left behind. The vehicle stopped with a creaking of old wood. Harrison, without saying a word, lowered Catherine's luggage and deposited it on the reddish earth. Then, with a gesture that could have been of respect or compassion, he inclined his head slightly and climbed back onto his seat. "I'll come to get you at the end of August, Miss Harding, as we agreed," he said, before shaking the reins and disappearing down the same dusty road they had arrived on. Catherine remained motionless in front of the property. The garden, once tended by Elizabeth's hands, now showed signs of abandonment. Wild grasses had invaded the flower beds, and the flowers her sister had loved so much had surrendered to Colorado's implacable nature. A wooden fence, partially fallen, surrounded what appeared to have been an orchard. Suddenly the cabin door opened. A tall man with broad shoulders and unkempt beard appeared in the doorway. His eyes, sunken in a face marked by sun and loss, fixed on her with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Catherine recognized in that gaze the reflection of her own pain. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, with a voice that sounded firmer than she felt. "I am Catherine Harding." Thomas Whitaker slowly descended the 3 steps separating the entrance from the ground. He stopped a few paces from her, as if afraid to come too close. The wind gently swayed the dark strands escaping from his worn hat. "I recognized you immediately," he replied, with a deep and rough voice. "You have the same eyes as she did." Those words, simple but loaded with meaning, caused a knot in Catherine's throat. For a moment, neither of them knew what to say. The weight of Elizabeth's absence seemed to materialize between them, as real and tangible as the mountains rising in the distance. "It has been a long journey," continued Thomas, breaking the silence. His hands, large and calloused, moved uncomfortably, as if they didn't know what to do with themselves. "You must be tired." He took Catherine's suitcases and headed toward the cabin. She followed him, observing his slightly hunched gait, the tension in his shoulders. This was the man her sister had chosen, the man with whom she had decided to build a life, a stranger to Catherine, and yet the guardian of Elizabeth's last moments. Upon crossing the threshold, the aroma of wood, fresh coffee, and something indefinable that Catherine immediately associated with the West enveloped her. The cabin, though modest, was more spacious than it appeared from outside. An oak table occupied the center of the main room, flanked by roughly carved chairs. A cast-iron stove dominated one of the walls, and above it hung pots and pans of various sizes. "I've prepared the back room for you," said Thomas, pointing toward a narrow hallway. It was where Elizabeth kept her sewing things. Ought you'd be more comfortable there." Catherine nodded, unable to articulate a word. In every corner of that house she felt the ghostly presence of her sister, in the shawl forgotten on a chair, in the preserve jars lined up on a shelf, in the small unfinished embroidery resting on an auxiliary table. "Thank you," she finally managed to say. "I appreciate you receiving me." Thomas looked at her for a long time, as if he wanted to say something more, but finally simply nodded. "Dinner will be ready in an hour," he murmured, before heading toward the kitchen. Catherine remained standing in the middle of the room, overwhelmed by the certainty that the next 3 months would change her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Dawn came to the cabin with a different light than Catherine knew in Boston. Here, the sun filtered through the pines with an almost liquid quality, bathing the floorboards with golden luminosity that slowly advanced through the room. During the first days, Catherine woke disoriented, momentarily lost among the unknown contours of foreign furniture. Then reality returned like a wave. She was in Colorado, in her deceased sister's house, sharing space with a man who was practically a stranger. The first week passed in a silence barely interrupted by polite phrases. Catherine, determined to fulfill her promise, dedicated herself to bringing order to the chaos that mourning had imposed on the dwelling. She cleaned until her hands were red and cracked, reorganized closets, washed sheets hardened by time and dust, planted seeds in the garden Elizabeth had left behind. Thomas, for his part, departed at dawn and returned at nightfall, dirty and tired from work with cattle and fences. They shared dinner in a silence that initially was uncomfortable, but gradually acquired an almost ritual quality, as if both needed that space of quiet to process the strange situation in which they found themselves. Sometimes Catherine caught him watching her when he thought she didn't notice. It wasn't an inappropriate look, but rather the perplexed gaze of someone trying to reconcile the image of one person with the memory of another. In those moments, Catherine felt a pang of discomfort. Did he see her, or did he see Elizabeth? One afternoon, while Catherine cleaned the highest shelf of the pantry, she found a small tin box. Inside, carefully folded, were several letters. She immediately recognized Elizabeth's handwriting. They were the letters she herself had sent to her sister from Boston, letters full of news about her students, about changes in the city, about newly published books she knew Elizabeth would love. With trembling fingers, Catherine read them one by one, rediscovering fragments of her own life through her absent sister's eyes. In the margins, Elizabeth had made annotations, small drawings, comments, exclamations of amazement or joy. Catherine felt tears running down her cheeks. It was like hearing Elizabeth's voice again, like having one last conversation with her. "They so were her treasure," said a voice from the door. Catherine was startled. Thomas was there watching her with an expression she couldn't decipher. She hadn't noticed his return. "She read them constantly," he continued, approaching slowly. She said it was her way of returning home for a moment. Catherine nodded, unable to speak. Thomas sat in front of her, in one of the kitchen chairs. His hands, dirty from fieldwork, rested on his knees. For the first time since her arrival, Catherine saw beyond the facade of hardness. She saw a man consumed by pain, desperately trying to stay standing. "There's something I've wanted to ask you," he said with a broken voice. "Was she happy, here with me? Was she happy?" The question floated between them, charged with vulnerability. Catherine felt that any answer she gave would define the course of her stay there. "In her letters," she finally responded, choosing each word carefully, "Elizabeth spoke of this place as her true home. She spoke of you with a love I had never seen in her before." The words seemed to relieve something within Thomas, his shoulders, always tense, relaxed slightly. He nodded, as if thanking for a long-awaited confirmation. "Tomorrow," he said, standing up, "if you agree, we could visit her grave." Catherine felt that something was subtly transforming between them. It wasn't friendship, not even camaraderie, but a mutual recognition. Two people united by the absence of a third, navigating together in the vast ocean of grief. "I would like that," she replied, carefully putting the letters back in the tin box. That night, while listening to the nocturnal sounds of the countryside, so different from the urban noises she was accustomed to, Catherine felt she was beginning to understand why Elizabeth had chosen this life, this place, this man. The Pine Ridge Cemetery was a small clearing among centennial pines, a space of silence where light filtered in dusty beams. Catherine walked a few steps behind Thomas, following the dirt path that snaked between simple headstones and wooden crosses. The air smelled of resin and damp earth, of freshly cut grass and something deeper, older, that seemed to emanate from the mountain itself. They stopped before a modest grave, a grey stone slab with Elizabeth's name carved in simple but careful letters, below the dates that framed a life too brief. Catherine felt her legs falter. Until that moment, her sister's death had been news, a letter, an abstract concept. Now, facing the physical evidence of her absence, reality struck her with all its force. Thomas remained standing, slightly apart, as if wanting to give her space for her grief. His tall and hunched figure stood out against the clear morning sky, motionless like one of the pines surrounding the cemetery. Catherine knelt in front of the grave. From her pocket, she extracted the small book of poems she had brought from Boston, the same one she shared with Elizabeth during the long winter, nights of their youth. With a soft but firm voice, she began to read a poem her sister used to recite. "Ask not for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee." The words flowed from her lips, like a river long contained. Catherine felt that each verse was a bridge extended toward Elizabeth, a way to reach her beyond the veil of death. Upon finishing, a thick silence enveloped the cemetery, broken only by the whisper of wind among the branches and the distant song of a solitary bird. When she looked up, she saw that Thomas's shoulders were shaking slightly. The man who seemed sculpted from the same rock as the mountains was crying silently without fanfare, but with an intensity that moved Catherine to her core. It was the first time she had seen him openly show his pain. She approached him, uncertain about how to proceed. Between them still existed a distance marked by courtesy and mutual wariness. But in that moment, united by shared pain, Catherine did what her heart dictated. She extended her hand and placed it gently on Thomas's arm. He didn't pull away. For a few minutes they remained like that, motionless, connected by that simple contact and by the love they had both professed for the woman who lay beneath the earth. "She loved poems," Thomas finally said with a hoarse voice. "Sometimes she read me fragments before sleeping. I didn't understand much, but I liked hearing her voice." Catherine nodded, remembering how as children they shared readings by candlelight, long after they were supposed to be asleep. "This was her favorite," she replied, showing him the open book. She said it reminded her of life's fragility and the importance of living it fully. Thomas looked at the worn pages, running a calloused finger over the lines underlined by Elizabeth's hand. Then, with a gesture that surprised Catherine, he removed his hat and held it against his chest in an act of reverence. "Thank you," he said simply, "for coming, for bringing this." While returning to the cabin, walking side by side under a sky beginning to cloud over, Catherine felt that something had changed between them. An invisible barrier had begun to dissolve, allowing a glimpse of the real man behind the facade of hardness and silence. That night, for the first time since her arrival, dinner was accompanied by conversation. They talked about Elizabeth, about her peculiarities, her dreams, her way of facing life. And in each shared anecdote, in each memory rescued from oblivion, Catherine felt her sister come to life again, even if just for an instant. "She would have wanted this," said Thomas while Catherine washed the dishes and he dried them. "For us to talk about her, to remember her laughing." Catherine nodded, feeling a strange peace settle in her chest. She had come to Colorado to fulfill a promise, to help a man reorganize his life. She hadn't expected to find consolation for her own pain, much less to begin a healing process she didn't even know she needed. June advanced with increasingly longer and warmer days. The routine that Catherine and Thomas had established, initially rigid due to mutual discomfort, began to flow more naturally. The mornings in the cabin acquired their own rhythm. Catherine rose at dawn to prepare breakfast. Thomas left for his labors in the field, and she dedicated herself to domestic tasks and the garden that, little by little, she was rescuing from abandonment. The seeds planted weeks ago were beginning to sprout, small green points opening their way toward the light. Catherine spent hours kneeling in the earth, pulling weeds, adjusting the irrigation, talking to the plants as if they could understand her. Sometimes, when she thought she was alone, she sang softly the same songs their mother had taught her and Elizabeth. The physical work, so different from her labor as a teacher in Boston, had a therapeutic effect she had never anticipated. Thomas returned at noon for a brief lunch, and then again at nightfall when they shared the day's most elaborate meal. Gradually, the uncomfortable silence gave way to tentative conversations. Catherine discovered that beneath Thomas's apparent roughness hid an observant and reflective man, with a natural intelligence that compensated for his limited formal education. One afternoon, while Catherine mended one of Thomas's shirts by the window, taking advantage of the natural light, he entered the cabin unexpectedly. He carried something in his hands, carefully wrapped in a cloth. "I found this while repairing the stable," he said, extending the bundle toward her. "I thought you'd like to have it." Catherine set aside her sewing and took the object. Upon unwrapping it, her heart skipped. It was a small wooden carving, a female figure with a book in her hands. She immediately recognized the style. Elizabeth had always had skill for carving small figures. "She made it last winter," Thomas explained, sitting across from her. "She said it was you, reading to your students." Catherine caressed the polished surface of the figure, feeling under her fingers the marks of the knife with which her sister had shaped the wood. It was a simple object, but charged with meaning, proof that Elizabeth had kept her present in her new life. "It's precious," she murmured, feeling tears threaten to emerge again. "Elizabeth talked a lot about you," continued Thomas, his gaze fixed on some indeterminate point beyond the window. "About how you cared for her after your parents died, about how you worked so she could finish her studies." Catherine nodded, remembering the difficult years after their parents' death. She was barely 20 when she assumed responsibility for her adolescent sister. She had sacrificed opportunities, including a marriage proposal, to ensure Elizabeth had the options she couldn't have. "I did what any sister would have done," she replied simply. Thomas looked at her then, with an intensity that disconcerted her. "No," he said firmly. "Not everyone would have made that sacrifice. Elizabeth knew it, and I know it too." Something in the way he said it, in the gravity of his voice, made Catherine feel an unexpected warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't a compassion she saw in his eyes, but genuine respect, a recognition of her strength that few people had granted her. "Did you never think of marrying?" he asked, with a frankness that in other circumstances might have seemed inappropriate. Catherine considered the question, weighing her response. She could have offered a polite evasion, but something in the atmosphere of confidence created between them impelled her to honesty. "There was someone years ago," she confessed, "a colleague from the school. He proposed marriage, but accepting would have meant sending Elizabeth to live with distant relatives. I couldn't do that to her." Thomas nodded, as if the answer confirmed something he already suspected. "And now," she continued, "I suppose I've reached that age where society expects a woman to resign herself to spinsterhood and dedicate herself to caring for nephews or charitable works." A fleeting smile crossed Thomas's face, the first Catherine had seen since her arrival. "Society has very narrow expectations," he commented, "especially for women." The observation, so removed from what Catherine would expect from a man of his environment and education, surprised her pleasantly. Perhaps there was more to Thomas Whitaker than appeared at first glance. The conversation drifted toward lighter topics, anecdotes from the school where Catherine taught, stories about Pine, Ridge neighbors, memories of childhood shared with Elizabeth. When they finally noticed the time, the sun had set completely and the room was plunged in shadows. While lighting the oil lamps, Catherine realized that, for the first time since her arrival, she felt truly comfortable in Thomas's presence. He was no longer simply her sister's widower, a stranger she should help out of moral obligation. She was beginning to glimpse the man Elizabeth had loved, and she understood why she had chosen him. The announcement of Pine Ridge's annual summer dance arrived in the form of a poster nailed to the cabin door. "Grand Community Dance," it read, in large and ornate letters. "Saturday, July 15th at the Patterson Barn. Music, food, and good company." Catherine observed the paper with curiosity while collecting eggs from the small henhouse. In Boston, she would have attended more formal social gatherings, concerts in private salons, poetry readings, charitable events organized by the school. A rural dance with fiddle and accordion music in a barn adapted for the occasion was as foreign to her experience as the mountains that now dominated her horizon. During dinner, Thomas mentioned the event in passing, as one comments on the weather. "I don't usually attend," he said, serving himself more of the stew Catherine had prepared, "but if you wanted to go, I could accompany you." There was something in his tone, a mixture of studied indifference and contained hope, that made Catherine look at him more closely. Under the beard he had begun trimming more carefully in recent weeks, she thought she detected a slight blush. "Did Elizabeth and you attend?" she asked, genuinely interested. Thomas nodded slowly. "Last year we danced until our feet hurt," he replied with a melancholic smile. Elizabeth adored dancing. She said music made her feel alive. Catherine remembered her sister as a teenager, spinning through the small parlor of their Boston house, inventing steps to the rhythm of imaginary melodies. She had always had that ethereal quality, that capacity to find joy in the simplest moments. "In that case," she said, making a sudden decision, "I think we should go. For Elizabeth." The night of the dance arrived faster than Catherine had anticipated. She found herself before the small mirror in her room, critically observing her reflection. She had brought few dresses to Colorado, all practical and sober, suitable for rural life. For the occasion, she had modified one of them, a blue cotton dress to which she added white lace at the collar and sleeves, a simple detail, but one that gave it a more festive air. Her hair habitually gathered in an austere bun, she had combed in a softer style, allowing some strands to frame her face. It wasn't vanity that drove her, she told herself, but respect for the occasion and for the community that had so kindly received her. When she came out to the main room, she found Thomas waiting for her. He had shaved completely for the first time since Catherine's arrival, revealing a younger face than she had imagined. He wore a clean white shirt, dark pants, and polished boots. He had combed his hair back, taming the rebellious curls that normally fell over his forehead. Something in his transformation, in the way he held himself erect, made Catherine feel an unexpected flutter in her stomach. For a fleeting instant, she saw him not as her sister's widower, but simply as a man, an attractive man who was looking at her with poorly disguised admiration. "You look very elegant," she managed to say, breaking the silence that threatened to become uncomfortable. Thomas cleared his throat, visibly nervous. You look very beautiful," he replied, with a direct honesty that made Catherine lower her gaze, suddenly conscious of the blush rising up her cheeks. The journey to the Patterson barn they made in Thomas's cart, under a sky studded, with stars brighter than Catherine remembered ever seeing. The night air brought with it the aroma of pines, of freshly watered earth, of wildflowers growing along the road. "It's beautiful here," she commented, contemplating the landscape bathed in the moon's silvery light. "I understand why Elizabeth loved this place so much." Thomas nodded, keeping his eyes fixed on the road. "At first I feared she wouldn't adapt," he confessed. "She came from a city, was accustomed to comforts I couldn't offer her, but she never complained. She said the beauty of these mountains compensated for any inconvenience." The Patterson barn had been transformed for the occasion. Colored lanterns hung from the beams, illuminating the space with a warm and welcoming glow. At one end, a small platform hosted the musicians, a fiddler, an accordionist, and a man with a banjo. Tables arranged around the improvised dance floor overflowed with food contributed by the families of the town: pies, stews, freshly baked bread, pitchers of lemonade and cider. Upon entering, Catherine felt all gazes turned toward her. She was still a novelty in Pine Ridge, the sister of deceased Elizabeth Whitaker, the Boston teacher who had come to help the widower. Conversations momentarily faded, but were soon replaced by cordial greetings and introductions. An older woman, with a kind face and calloused hands, approached them. "I'm Ruth Patterson," she introduced herself, warmly shaking Catherine's hand. "Welcome to our little celebration, dear." Soon Catherine found herself surrounded by neighbors who spoke to her of Elizabeth, of how much they had appreciated her, of how she had helped in their children's births or had taught the town girls to read during the winter. Each story added a new facet to the image she had of her sister, showing her aspects of her life that the letters had barely sketched. Thomas remained nearby, silent but attentive, intervening occasionally to clarify a detail or add an anecdote. Catherine noticed how his posture, habitually tense, gradually relaxed in the company of his neighbors. Here he was respected, an integral part of a community that sustained itself mutually in the harsh frontier conditions. The music began, cheerful and lively. Couples quickly formed, filling the floor with turns and laughter. Catherine watched, fascinated by the celebration's spontaneity, so different from the rigid society dances she knew. "Shall we dance?" asked a voice beside her. It wasn't Thomas, but a middle-aged man, tall and distinguished in bearing. "Daniel Foster," he introduced himself with an affable smile. "I'm the town doctor. I knew your sister well." Before Catherine could respond, she felt a presence behind her. Thomas had approached, and something in his expression, a barely perceptible tension in his jaw, surprised her. "Miss Harding had promised me the first piece," he said, with a courtesy that didn't quite hide a possessive tone Catherine had never heard from him. Daniel Foster inclined his head, accepting the situation with elegance. "In that case, I'll wait my turn," he replied, before moving away toward another group. Thomas extended his hand toward Catherine. She took it, feeling the warmth of his palm against hers, the roughness of calluses formed by years of hard work. As he guided her toward the floor, Catherine wondered if she had imagined that flash of, what? Jealousy, possessiveness? The idea was absurd. Thomas loved Elizabeth. Catherine was simply his sister, a temporary presence in his life, and yet while they turned to the music's rhythm, Thomas's hands firm but gentle on her waist, Catherine felt a connection that went beyond the circumstances that had united them. For a moment, she allowed herself to forget the mourning, the promise, the duty. She allowed herself to be simply a woman dancing with a man under a starry sky, on a summer night that seemed suspended outside of time. July slipped toward August, with the inexorability of a river flowing toward the sea. Catherine, sitting on the cabin's small porch, contemplated the sunset while darning one of Thomas's socks. The sky's colors, oranges, purples, intense reds fading into deep blue, seemed more vibrant than ever, as if nature wanted to engrave their beauty in her memory before she departed. The date of her return to Boston was approaching. Within 3 weeks, Harrison would arrive with his stagecoach to take her back to Junction Creek, where she would take the train that would return her to her former life. A life that now, strangely, seemed distant and alien, like a dream that fades upon waking. The sound of hooves announced Thomas's return. She watched him dismount with the natural grace of one who had spent his life on horseback. In these months, she had learned to read his movements, to interpret the small gestures that revealed his state of mind. Today she noticed him tense, worried about something she couldn't guess. "There's a storm coming," he announced upon climbing the porch steps. "You can smell it in the air." Catherine nodded. She too had perceived that particular smell, that electricity charging the atmosphere before a mountain storm. During her stay, she had learned to identify weather signs, to prepare for nature's whims that in Boston she barely noticed. Thomas sat beside her on the wooden bench, maintaining a respectful distance. Despite the growing camaraderie between them, he always maintained that invisible barrier, that line he didn't dare cross. "This came for you," he said, extending an envelope. Harrison brought it when he passed through town. Catherine immediately recognized the seal of the Boston Ladies' School where she taught. With slightly trembling fingers, she opened the letter. It was from the director, Mrs. Pembroke, asking if she would confirm her return for the start of the school year in September. They needed to know urgently to make necessary arrangements. "Bad news?" asked Thomas, observing how her face changed while she read. "No," she replied, folding the letter again. "Just confirmation that they're expecting me back." A heavy silence fell between them. In the distance, lightning momentarily illuminated the mountains, followed several seconds later by thunder's rumble. Catherine. It was the first time Thomas had used her first name. It had always been Miss Harding, maintaining a formality that now seemed absurd after so many weeks sharing roof meals, conversations. "I don't want you to leave." The words, simple but loaded with meaning, hung suspended between them. Catherine felt her heart accelerate, her breathing become shallow. What was he saying? What was he asking? "Thomas, Please let me speak," he interrupted, with an urgency that surprised her. "I know you came here for Elizabeth, for a promise you made to her. I know your life is in Boston with your students, your books, your world, but these months have been—" He stopped, searching for words. Thomas wasn't a man of great speeches, of flowery declarations. He was a man of action, of simple and direct truths. "When Elizabeth died, I thought I would never feel anything again, that I would live the rest of my days like a ghost, going through the motions of life without really living it." Catherine watched him, unable to interrupt. The sky was darkening rapidly, the storm approaching with each second. "And then you arrived," he continued, "with your books and your city ways, and that way you have of seeing beauty in things I took for granted. And something awakened inside me, something I thought dead and buried with Elizabeth." He took a breath, as if preparing to leap into the void. "I love you, Catherine. Not in the same way I loved Elizabeth. That love is still there, always will be. But in a new, different way. And I know it's precipitous, that maybe it's inappropriate so soon after. But the idea of you leaving, of not seeing you every morning, in the kitchen, of not hearing your voice reading by the fire at night, is unbearable to me." The first drops of rain began to fall thick and heavy on the cabin roof. Catherine felt the world around her fade, that only she, Thomas, and the words he had just spoken existed. "I ask you to stay," he said finally. "Not as Elizabeth's sister, not as a visitor, but as my wife. If your feelings allow it, if you can see in me not just your sister's widower, but a man who loves you for who you are." Catherine lowered her gaze to her hands, which had remained motionless on her sewing work. A whirlwind of emotions traversed her: surprise, confusion, fear, and something more, something that had been silently growing during these weeks, and that she could no longer deny. "I need time," she finally managed to say. "This is unexpected." Thomas nodded, understanding. "Of course," he replied, standing up. "Take all the time you need. My heart is in your hands." The rain was getting heavier when he entered the cabin, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Catherine remained on the porch, allowing some drops to splash her, as if the external storm could calm the tempest unleashing inside her. What did she really feel for Thomas? Was it possible to love the man who had been her sister's husband? Wouldn't it be a betrayal to Elizabeth's memory? And then there was Boston, her life there, the independence she had built with so much effort. The rain now fell with force, a liquid veil that blurred the landscape. Catherine thought of Elizabeth, of her courage in abandoning the security of the known to follow her heart to these wild mountains. Would she have the same courage? With Mrs. Pembroke's letter crumpled between her fingers, Catherine Harding contemplated the storm, feeling her future hanging by a thread as fragile as it was beautiful. During the following days, Catherine avoided Thomas as much as was possible in the cabin's limited space. She woke before dawn to prepare breakfast and left it ready before he appeared. She spent long hours in the garden, where the plants she had sown upon arriving now bloomed vigorously, silent testimony to the time that had passed. At night she retired early to her room, feigning fatigue or headache. Thomas respected her distance, but Catherine could feel his gaze when he thought she didn't notice. A patient, hopeful gaze that followed her like a kind shadow. Mrs. Pembroke's letter remained unanswered on her room's small table. Every time she tried to draft a response, words refused to flow. How to explain what she was experiencing, how to name the contradictory feelings tormenting her. One morning, unable to bear the tension that had settled in the cabin any longer, Catherine made an impulsive decision. She left a brief note indicating she would return before nightfall, and set off on the path to the cemetery. The day was clear, the sky an intense blue that seemed almost unreal. The B-da storm from days ago had washed the world, leaving it fresh and renewed. Catherine walked with determined step, her dress hem brushing the tall grasses bordering the trail. Upon reaching the cemetery, she found Elizabeth's grave exactly as she remembered. Someone, Thomas surely, had recently left wildflowers. Catherine knelt on the still damp earth, feeling a strange calm take hold of her. "I've come to talk to you," she murmured, feeling slightly ridiculous speaking to a stone. but needing somehow the connection with her sister. "I'm confused, Lizzie, and scared." The wind whispered among the pines, as if nature itself held its breath to listen. "Thomas has asked me to stay, to be his wife," she continued, words now flowing more easily. "And I don't know what to do. I don't know what you would feel, if you would see this as a betrayal or as a blessing." She closed her eyes, remembering Elizabeth in different moments of her life, as a golden-curled child running through the halls of their Boston house, as a teenager avidly reading romantic novels in secret, as a young woman saying goodbye at the station with eyes bright with excitement for the adventure awaiting her. "You were always the brave one," Catherine whispered, "the one who followed," her heart without hesitation. "I was the practical one, the sensible one, the one who thought about consequences. And now here I am, contemplating the possibility of doing something completely impulsive and irrational." An orange butterfly momentarily landed on the headstone, its wings spreading like small silk fans. Catherine watched it, hypnotized by the insect's fragile and ephemeral beauty. "I love him," she finally admitted, words escaping her lips like a long-contained confession. "I don't know when it happened or how, but I love him, and I'm terrified by the idea of betraying you, of usurping your place." The butterfly took flight, disappearing among the sun rays filtering through the branches. Catherine followed its trajectory with her gaze, feeling that somehow it was a sign, a message from the sister who could no longer embrace or advise her. "You always said life is too short to waste on regrets," she continued, a sad smile drawing on her lips. "That we should embrace happiness when we found it, because we never knew how long it would last." Elizabeth's words, pronounced years ago in a completely different context, now acquired new meaning, new depth. Catherine remembered the last letter she had received from her sister, weeks before her death. In it, Elizabeth spoke of the peace she had found in these mountains, of how Thomas had taught her to appreciate beauty in the simple, in the everyday. "He made you happy," Catherine murmured, running her fingers over the letters carved in the stone. "And I know you would want him to be happy again, but with me, the sister who was always in your shadow, who never had your beauty, your free spirit." A stronger gust of wind shook the pine branches, creating a melody that seemed to answer her questions. Catherine closed her eyes, letting the sound envelop her, imagining for a moment that it was Elizabeth's voice, her crystalline laugh, her unique way of seeing the world. When she finally stood up, the sun had begun its descent toward the horizon. Catherine felt strangely light, as if a weight she had been carrying for weeks or perhaps her entire life had lightened. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't know with certainty what her final decision would be. But for the first time, since Thomas's confession, she felt she had permission to listen to her heart, to consider the possibility of a happiness she had never imagined for herself. "Thank you, Lizzie," she whispered, touching the headstone one last time before turning around. "For everything." The return path to the cabin seemed different, illuminated by the sunset's golden light that transformed the ordinary into extraordinary. Catherine walked with firm step, each stride taking her away from the past and bringing her closer to a future she was just beginning to glimpse. Upon reaching the small hill from where the property was visible, she stopped for a moment. In the distance she saw Thomas's figure, working on the corral fences. His body moved with the security and strength of one who intimately knows his labor. Catherine watched him, allowing herself for the first time to see him not as Elizabeth's widower, but simply as the man he was, honest, hard-working, with a sensitivity hidden beneath his rough appearance. And while the sun hid behind the mountains, tinting the sky crimson and gold, Catherine Harding felt something inside her finally align, like the pieces of a puzzle that at last found their place. Sunday morning, Catherine and Thomas attended the religious service together at Pine Ridge's small church. Built with logs and local stone, the church was a simple but welcoming building, with narrow windows that let dusty beams of light fall on the polished wooden pews. Catherine had noticed a change in some townspeople's attitude toward her. The kind smiles and cordial conversations had been replaced in some cases by sidelong glances and barely disguised whispers. She didn't need to listen to imagine the content of those murmurs. the deceased's sister, so quick to take her place, the widower forgetting his wife too soon. Ruth Patterson, who had always been particularly kind, approached them after the service, while the congregation slowly dispersed. "Catherine, dear," she said, taking her hands between hers, "could you accompany me for a moment? I have something I'd like to show you." Catherine nodded, casting a quick glance at Thomas, who was conversing with the Reverend. She followed Ruth to the back of the church, where a small cemetery housed the town's oldest graves. "I wanted to speak with you privately," Ruth began, once they were alone. Her face, normally affable, now showed a seriousness that alarmed Catherine. "I've noticed how some look at you, the comments they make when they think no one is listening." Catherine felt her cheeks burn. She hadn't told anyone about Thomas's proposal, hadn't even given an answer to the man in question, and yet the town seemed to have already decided there was something improper between them. "I haven't done anything indecent," she defended herself, with more vehemence than she intended. Ruth smiled sadly. "I know, dear, you don't need to justify yourself to me, but this is a small town and people talk, especially Beatrice Harper and her circle of gossips who have nothing better to do than judge others' lives." Catherine had met Beatrice Harper at the community dance, a middle-aged woman widowed like Thomas, whose gaze had followed her every movement with uncomfortable scrutiny. "What I wanted to tell you," Ruth continued, "is to pay them no mind. Elizabeth was loved here, and her loss still hurts. But she would have been the first to want Thomas to find comfort and companionship, especially if that companionship came from someone who also loved her." Ruth's words resonated deeply in Catherine. It was as if the woman had read her thoughts, her most intimate fears. "When my first husband died," Ruth continued, her gaze lost in the distance, "I thought I could never love again. I spent 2 years in rigid mourning, rejecting any type of joy as if it were a betrayal to his memory. And then I met Patterson. He was so different from my Charles. Where Charles had been quiet and reflective, Patterson was boisterous and direct. I resisted at first, convinced it wasn't appropriate that people would talk." She paused, and a genuine smile illuminated her face. "And of course they talked. For a time I was the main topic of every sewing meeting, every gathering after church. But do you know what? Those rumors faded, as they always do, and what remained was a new life, different from the previous one but equally valuable." Catherine felt tears threatening to emerge. Ruth Patterson, with her wisdom born of experience, had put into words something she herself was just beginning to understand. That love wasn't a limited quantity, that loving Thomas wouldn't diminish the love she had felt for Elizabeth. "I don't know what's between Thomas and you," Ruth concluded, gently squeezing her hand, "but I know you both deserve to find peace and happiness, whether together or separately, and whatever your decision, you'll always have a friend in me." The returned to the cabin they made in silence. Catherine could feel the tension in Thomas, the way his shoulders had slightly hunched before the gazes and whispers. He was a proud man, unaccustomed to being the subject of gossip. "I'm sorry you have to endure this because of me," he finally said when they were far from town. Catherine looked at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. "It's not your fault," she replied firmly. "People always need something to talk about. In a few weeks they'll find a new topic to entertain them." Thomas nodded, but she could see her words hadn't completely convinced him. For a man who had built his life in these mountains, who depended on the community not only for commerce, but also for the mutual support that frontier life demanded, the town's disapproval wasn't a trivial matter. "Ruth told me her story," Catherine added, searching for the right words. How she found new love after losing her first husband, how people talked but eventually accepted her happiness. Thomas glanced at her sideways, a glimmer of hope momentarily illuminating his dark eyes. "Ruth is a good woman," he commented, "one of the few truly wise people I know." The rest of the journey passed in more comfortable silence. When the cabin appeared in view, bathed in afternoon light, Catherine felt a strange sensation of belonging. In these months, that place that had initially seemed so foreign had gradually become a home. While Thomas unhitched the horse, Catherine remained standing by the fence, observing the landscape extending before her, the majestic mountains in the distance, the fields beginning to golden under the late July sun, the small stream that meandered near the property reflecting light like a silver ribbon. Could she leave all this behind? Return to Boston's cobblestone streets, to her solitary apartment, to classrooms full of girls who, though she appreciated them, would never truly be hers. Could she forget the sound of wind among the pines, the scent of earth after rain, the quietude of mountain mornings? And more importantly, could she forget Thomas, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the warmth of his hand when he helped her into the cart, the cadence of his voice when he told her stories of the West by the fire? Catherine Harding, who had always been the sensible sister, the one who planned each step carefully, now found herself at the most important crossroads of her life. And for the first time, the decision didn't seem to be in her reason's hands, but in a heart that had remained asleep too long. The letter to Mrs. Pembroke rested finished on the desk. Catherine had written and rewritten it countless times during the past week, searching for the exact words to explain her decision. The final result was brief but sincere. She would not return to Boston for the start of the school year. She requested an indefinite leave, offering her resignation if this wasn't possible. She sealed the envelope with slightly trembling hands. The simple act of pressing the wax seemed charged with almost ritualistic symbolism. She was sealing one chapter of her life, beginning another completely unknown. The sound of approaching hooves alerted her. Through the window, she saw Harrison stopping his stagecoach in front of the cabin. It was Thursday, the day he made his regular route between Junction Creek and the more remote settlements, carrying correspondence and orders. Catherine took the letter and went out to the porch. The August sun fell implacably on the yard, creating heat waves that distorted the air. Harrison greeted her with a gesture of his worn hat. "Good morning, Miss Harding," he said, descending heavily from the driver's seat. "Do you have anything to send today?" Catherine nodded, extending the letter to him. "To Boston, please. It's important." Harrison took the envelope, examining it, briefly before storing it in his leather bag. "It'll be on tomorrow's train," he assured her. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he added, "I also came to confirm about your return trip. Only 2 weeks left. Are we still on for August 30th? The question, though expected, provoked an oppression in Catherine's chest. This was the moment to make her decision official, to pronounce it aloud before someone other than herself. "No." "Mr. Harrison," she replied, surprised by the firmness in her own voice, "I've decided to stay a while longer." The older man looked at her with eyes that had seen too much of life to be easily surprised. He nodded slowly, as if the news confirmed something he already suspected. "The West has that quality," he commented with a barely perceptible smile under his thick mustache. "It traps people, makes them see the world differently." Catherine thought about how true his words were. These months in Colorado had changed something fundamental in her. They had connected her with a part of herself she didn't know existed, a woman capable of facing difficulties she had never imagined, of finding beauty in austerity, of opening her heart when she thought it was permanently closed to certain emotions. "That's true," she agreed with a smile. After Harrison departed, Catherine remained on the porch, watching how the stagecoach moved away, leaving behind a cloud of dust. That slowly dissipated in the hot air. She had taken the first step. Now remained the most difficult, talking to Thomas. She hadn't seen him since dawn, when he departed to check the cattle in the high pastures. He wouldn't return until sunset. Catherine had hours ahead to prepare. What she would say, to rehearse the words that would change the course of both their lives. She spent the afternoon in a state of nervous anticipation. She cleaned the cabin from top to bottom, prepared a more elaborate dinner than usual, even cut wildflowers from the garden to put in a jar on the table. She wanted everything to be perfect for the moment of truth. When she finally heard the familiar sound of Thomas's footsteps on the porch, Catherine felt her heart accelerate. She nervously smoothed her hair, checked one last time that everything was in order, and waited. Thomas entered, leaving his hat on the hook by the door. The smell of earth, sweat, and open air entered with him, that aroma Catherine had come to associate with the feeling of home. He stopped upon seeing the carefully set table, the flowers, the steaming food. "Is something special happening?" he asked with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Catherine nodded, indicating he should sit. "I wanted to talk to you," she said, serving him a plate of the stew she had been slowly cooking all afternoon. "About your proposal." Thomas, visibly, tensed. During the past weeks he had respected her space without mentioning the subject, without pressing her. But Catherine knew the uncertainty tormented him, that each passing day without an answer was a small agony for him. "I'm listening," he said simply, with that economy of words so characteristic of him. Catherine took a breath. She had rehearsed this moment dozens of times in her mind, but now all the carefully prepared words seemed to have vanished. Only naked truth remained, without adornments or elaborations. "I'm staying," she said, with a soft but clear voice. "I accept your proposal, Thomas." His face remained motionless for an instant, as if the words took time to penetrate the barrier of negative expectations he had built. Then, slowly, a transformation occurred. Tension left his shoulders. The perpetually furrowed brow relaxed, and in his eyes appeared a brightness Catherine had never seen. "Are you sure?" he asked, with a voice hoarse from contained emotion. "I don't want you to feel obligated out of pity or a sense of duty toward Elizabeth." Catherine shook her head. "I've thought about it a lot," she replied. "I've weighed all the possibilities, all the paths, and this is the one I choose. Not for Elizabeth, though she will always be part of our lives. I choose it for me." "For what?" "I feel for you." Thomas extended his hand across the table, seeking hers. Catherine intertwined her fingers with his, feeling the warmth, the strength, the implicit promise in that simple contact. "It won't be easy," he warned. "Life here is hard, and there will be those who don't understand who will talk." "I know," Catherine nodded, "but I've discovered I'm stronger than I believed, and that others' opinions matter less than what the heart dictates." Thomas then stood, going around the table to kneel beside her. From his pocket he extracted a small object Catherine recognized immediately, a simple ring, a gold band with a tiny inlaid sapphire. "It was my mother's," he explained. "I kept it all these years, waiting for the right moment to give it. When I met Elizabeth, I knew that moment had come, but she insisted on having a new wedding ring, something that was only ours." Catherine understood what he wasn't saying, that this ring represented not only a commitment to her, but a way to connect their future with Thomas's past, with his roots, with the family he had left behind when coming west. "It's perfect," she murmured, as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It was slightly large, but the weight of the metal, the smoothness of the stone, polished by generations of use, felt right, as if it had been destined for her. Thomas stood, drawing her toward him in an embrace. It was the first time they had touched this way, so intimate and yet so pure. Catherine rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beating of his heart, feeling the solidity of his presence. "I will make you happy," he promised against her hair, "every day with every breath I have left." Catherine closed her eyes, allowing herself to believe completely in that promise, in the future opening before them. A future neither of them had. Imagined, born of tragedy but transformed by hope, by the human capacity to find light even in the darkest moments. That night, while the full moon bathed the mountains with its silvery light, Catherine Harding understood she had found not only new love but a new version of herself, a woman capable of taking the reins of her destiny, of choosing happiness even when the path toward it was strewn with doubts and difficulties. And for the first time since Elizabeth's death, she allowed herself to dream without guilt, to love without reservations, to live without fear of tomorrow. September arrived with cooler air and a new rye. Them in the cabin. News of the engagement between Thomas Whitaker and Catherine Harding had spread through Pine Ridge like wildfire in dry prairie. Reactions were diverse, from the genuine joy of Ruth Patterson and her circle to the barely disguised gestures of disapproval from Beatrice Harper and her followers. Catherine had decided the wedding would be simple but meaningful. She wouldn't have the traditional white dress. It seemed inappropriate given the circumstances, but rather a light blue dress she was making with fabrics Ruth had helped her obtain. The color was a silent homage to Elizabeth, whose favorite dress had been that same shade. "Are you sure you don't want to wait longer?" asked Ruth one afternoon while helping Catherine with the preparations. "No one would think badly if you decided to wait until next year." Catherine gently shook her. head while cutting a pattern on the fabric spread on the table. "We've waited enough," she replied with a determination that surprised even herself. "Not for social convention, but out of respect for our own feelings. Now that we've made the decision, I see no reason to postpone it." Ruth nodded, a smile of approval illuminating her weathered face. "You have Elizabeth's sensibility and something more," she commented, threading a needle. "An inner strength that will be very useful in Colorado winters." The mention of winters made Catherine feel an involuntary shiver. She had arrived in May, experiencing only the sweetness of late spring and summer's warmth in the mountains. Thomas had told her about snowstorms that isolated the property for days, about cold that froze even breath, about the need to prepare meticulously to survive the hardest months. "We'll face them together," he had said, with that quiet confidence she had learned to value. And Catherine believed him. Together, they had already survived a different, but equally devastating storm, that of pain, loss, guilt, uncertainty. Date was set for the end of September after harvest, when the community would have a respite before beginning winter preparations. It would be a ceremony in the cabin's garden, that same garden Catherine had rescued from abandonment, and that now bloomed with renewed vigor, as if nature itself wanted to celebrate their union. Reverend Davis, a middle-aged man with a natural kindness emanating from every gesture, visited the cabin to discuss the ceremony's details. He had known Elizabeth well, had officiated her funeral just months ago. Catherine feared he might judge her, might see her decision as an affront to her sister's memory. Instead, she found understanding and support. "Love is not a limited quantity, Miss Harding," he told her, with that measured voice he used in his sermons. "It doesn't exhaust itself by being shared, nor diminish when it includes more people. God gives us the capacity to love many times, in different ways." His words were a balm for the last vestige of doubt still persisting in Catherine's heart. There were moments, generally in the night's quiet, when she wondered if she was doing right, if she wasn't somehow betraying Elizabeth, if she wasn't usurping her place in some way. One afternoon, while reviewing the contents of the trunk she had brought from Boston, Catherine found the locket with Elizabeth's hair strand. She held it between her fingers, feeling its weight, remembering the day Elizabeth had given it to her as a connection talisman between them. "When I feel lonely," Elizabeth had said, "I'll think that you have a little piece of me with you, and I'll feel better." Carefully, Catherine opened it. The golden strand was still there, bright as the day it was cut. Impelled by a feeling she couldn't name, Catherine took small scissors and cut a strand of her own hair, brown and straight, so different from her sister's. She placed it next to Elizabeth's, then closed the locket. That small act seemed like a bridge between past and present, a way to include Elizabeth in the new life about to begin. Not to replace her or forget her, but to honor her, to keep her present in the very fabric of her shared existence with Thomas. Thomas, for his part, showed himself more open, more communicative since Catherine had accepted his proposal. It was as if a long-sealed gate had opened, allowing him to express not only the love he felt for her, but also memories of his life before Colorado, of his childhood in Pennsylvania, of the parents he had lost too young, of the dreams that had driven him westward. One night, sitting on the porch under a star-studded sky, Thomas took Catherine's hand, distractedly caressing the ring now adorning her finger. "I never thought I'd find this twice in one lifetime," he confessed with a grave voice. "When Elizabeth died, I thought the part of me capable of loving had died with her. And then you came, so different from her, and yet with that same spirit. That made me love her." Catherine rested her head on his shoulder, allowing herself that contact which now felt natural, necessary. "Sometimes I wonder what she would think," she replied, voicing the doubt that still occasionally assailed her. "If she would see us and smile, or if she would feel we've forgotten her too quickly." Thomas remained silent for a moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Elizabeth loved life," he finally said. "She loved joy, celebrated it wherever she found it. I remember once, shortly after we moved here, when a storm destroyed part of the roof. I was furious, worried about repair costs. And do you know what she did?" Catherine shook her head, intrigued. "She went out in the rain and began to dance. just like that, without more, dancing while water soaked her dress, her hair, everything. When I asked if she'd gone mad, she answered, "We can lament what we lost or celebrate what we have. I choose to celebrate." The image was so vivid, so characteristically Elizabeth, that Catherine felt laughter bubble in her throat. Thomas accompanied her, and soon they were both laughing together under the stars, united by the memory of the woman they had both loved. "I think she would choose to celebrate," Thomas concluded when the laughter faded. Celebrate that the two people she loved most in the world found consolation and happiness together. Catherine nodded, feeling a quiet certainty replace her doubts. Elizabeth would be with them somehow in each shared laugh, in each difficulty faced together, in each moment of beauty they knew how to recognize and appreciate. And with that certainty, in her heart, Catherine Harding continued preparations for the wedding that would mark not the end of a story, but the beginning of another. Interwoven with threads from the past, but extended toward a future full of possibilities, the day dawned with a clarity that seemed almost unreal. The September sky extended over the mountains like a silk mantle of blue, without a single cloud interrupting its perfection. A gentle breeze swayed the wildflowers Catherine had planted in the garden, spreading their fragrance through the fresh morning air. Ruth Patterson had arrived early to help her with the final preparations. Now, standing in the small room that had been her refuge during these months, Catherine contemplated her reflection in the mirror. The light blue dress, with its simple but elegant cut, fit her better than she had hoped. It wasn't a bride's traditional attire, but it perfectly reflected her situation. A woman beginning a new chapter in her life, honoring the past, but looking toward the future. "You're beautiful," said Ruth, placing a bouquet of white flowers in her gathered hair. "Like a storybook bride," Catherine smiled, grateful for the calming presence of the older woman. In recent months, Ruth had become something like a mother to her, a guide on the unexplored path she had decided to walk. "I'm nervous," she confessed, smoothing an imaginary wrinkle in her dress skirt. "Not about the decision, but about everything. About becoming a wife, about officially becoming part of this community, about the responsibilities that will come." Ruth nodded understandingly. "Marriage is a journey, dear," she replied, adjusting the dress collar. "Not a destination. The important thing isn't arriving perfect at the altar, but learning to grow together day by day." From the window, Catherine could see the preparations in the garden. Neighbors and friends had arrived early to help, men placing improvised benches. Under the large oak, women arranging tables with white tablecloths where food each family had contributed would rest. It was a community celebration, frontier style, where individual resources were limited but collective generosity created abundance. "It's time now," announced Ruth, consulting the small watch hanging from a chain on her chest. "Are you ready?" Catherine breathed deeply, feeling an unexpected calm take hold of her. "I am," she replied, with a security coming from the depths of her being. Upon going out to the porch, the sound of a violin greeted her. Someone, she couldn't see who, was playing a sweet and melancholic melody that made her throat tighten. It was the same song that had sounded at the community dance, the night Thomas and she had danced together for the first time. The garden had been transformed. Colored ribbons hung from the oak branches, swayed by the breeze like living streamers. Wildflowers adorned each bench, each table, creating an explosion of color that contrasted beautifully with the grass green and sky blue. And there, under the oak, Thomas waited. He had changed his practical work attire for a dark suit, probably the same one he had worn at his wedding, with Elizabeth. His hair, habitually rebellious, was carefully combed back, taming the stubborn curls that normally fell over his forehead. He had trimmed his beard with precision, and his usually dirt-stained hands were clean and carefully groomed. Something in his transformation, in the way he held himself erect, made Catherine feel an unexpected flutter in her stomach. For a fleeting instant she saw him not as her sister's widower, but simply as a man, an attractive man looking at her with poorly disguised admiration. Reverend Davis waited beside him, with his Bible open in his hands. The Pine Ridge neighbors occupied the benches, some with expressions of genuine happiness, others with more reserved but respectful faces. Catherine recognized Daniel Foster among the crowd, the doctor who had shown interest in her during the dance. He directed a courteous nod toward her, which she returned with a kind smile without a trace of resentment. Ruth accompanied her to the improvised altar, fulfilling the role that would traditionally correspond to the bride's father. The violin continued its melody, now more jubilant, accompanying each of Catherine's steps toward her future. Upon arriving beside Thomas, Ruth took Catherine's hand and placed it over his, a symbolic gesture of transference, blessing, continuity. "Take good care of her," murmured the older woman, before retiring to take her place among the guests. The ceremony was brief but moving. Reverend Davis spoke about love as a renewing force, about the human capacity to find light even in the darkest moments. His words, chosen with sensitivity, didn't ignore the particular circumstances that had brought Catherine and Thomas to this moment, but rather integrated them into a broader narrative of redemption and hope. When the time for vows arrived, Thomas took Catherine's hands between his. His palms, calloused by years of hard work, transmitted a warmth that seemed to flow directly toward her heart. "Catherine," he began with a grave but clear voice, "I promise to honor and respect you, to care for you in sickness and health, in abundance and scarcity. I promise to build with you a home where the past has its place, but doesn't overshadow our present. I promise to love you with everything I am, with everything I have been, and with everything I will become, thanks to you." The words, simple but profound, provoked silent tears in Catherine. When her turn came, her voice trembled slightly, but gained firmness as she spoke. "Thomas," she said, looking directly into his eyes, "I promise to walk beside you in every season, to share your joys and sorrows as if they were mine. I promise to respect your history, honor your strength, and nourish your dreams. I promise to be your companion, your friend, your confidant. And I promise to love you with an open heart, grateful for the unexpected gift you have been in my life." The exchange of rings was equally significant. Along with the family ring Thomas had already given her, now Catherine slipped onto his finger, a simple gold band they had bought on their last trip to town. Two different rings, like different their stories were, but now united in the same purpose. "By the power conferred upon me by God and this community," finally proclaimed Reverend Davis, "I declare you husband and wife." The kiss that sealed their union was chaste but charged with promise. Around them neighbors applauded, some threw flower petals, others simply smiled, moved by the spectacle of a love that had bloomed in improbable circumstances. The celebration that followed had that spontaneous and genuine character so characteristic of frontier communities. Food was abundant, music cheerful, conversations flowed naturally. Catherine, now officially Mrs. Whitaker, found herself integrated into a social fabric that weeks ago had seemed impenetrable to her. Even Beatrice Harper approached to offer her congratulations with a rigid but sincere formality. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, tinting the sky with reddish and golden tones, Thomas took Catherine's hand and quietly led her toward a more secluded corner of the garden. There, protected by a willow's shadow, was a small stone bench Catherine hadn't noticed before. "I built it for you," Thomas explained, inviting her to sit, "so you'd have a place to read or simply contemplate the mountains." The gesture, so considerate and personal, moved Catherine deeply. It was tangible proof that Thomas really saw her, that he understood her needs and desires, that he cared about her happiness beyond practical conveniences. "It's perfect," she murmured, running her hand over the stone's smooth surface. "Thank you." Thomas sat beside her, surrounding her shoulders with a protective arm. Together they watched twilight gradually envelop the landscape, transforming the familiar into something new and magical. "You know," he said after a long shared silence, "when Elizabeth died, I thought I'd never feel peace again, that I'd live the rest of my days with that sensation of emptiness, of something irreparably broken inside me." Catherine rested her head on his shoulder, listening attentively. It was rare for Thomas to speak so openly about his most intimate feelings. "And now, here with you," he continued, "I feel I've found not the same peace I knew before, but a new one. Different, but equally valuable, equally real." Catherine understood exactly what he meant. She herself had experienced that transformation. The pain hadn't disappeared. Elizabeth's absence continued being an undeniable reality in their lives. But alongside that absence, something new had grown, something that didn't deny or replace. It but existed in parallel, enriching their experience of the world. "We are fortunate," she replied simply, intertwining her fingers with his. "To have loved so much, to have lost so much, and still find the courage to love again." The first stars began to appear in the increasingly dark sky. In the distance, in the garden illuminated by lamps and candles, the celebration continued. But here, in this quiet corner, Catherine and Thomas shared a moment of intimacy that transcended words, a connection born of tragic circumstances, but now shining with its own light. Catherine Harding, now Catherine Whitaker, contemplated the ring on her finger, feeling its weight, its meaning, the responsibility and joy it represented. She had come to Colorado as Elizabeth's sister, a Boston teacher fulfilling a solemn promise. But she was staying as herself, a woman who had found her place in the world, a love she hadn't sought, but that had completely transformed her. And while shadows lengthened and night fell over the mountains, she knew with certainty that this wasn't the continuation of Elizabeth's story, but the beginning of her own. A story that would honor the past, but wouldn't be limited by it. A story that, starting today, she would write day by day alongside the man who now held her among his arms like the most precious of treasures. Winter arrived in the mountains with a fury that Catherine, despite Thomas's warnings, hadn't been able to completely imagine. Snow fell incessantly, accumulating in layers that transformed the familiar landscape into an alien territory, white and implacable. Wind howled around the cabin like a hungry beast, seeking any crack through which to slip. But inside, protected by thick log walls and the stove's constant heat, Catherine and Thomas had created a refuge against the climate's hostility. Afternoons stretched into shared readings by the fire, conversations extending well into the night, small domestic rituals weaving the fabric of their life together. Catherine had discovered resources in herself she didn't know she possessed. She had learned to preserve food for months of scarcity, to mend clothes with a skill that surprised even Ruth, to keep the cabin clean and orderly even when snow filtered under the door and mud seemed to multiply beneath her feet. Thomas, for his part, watched her with a pride he didn't try to hide. "You're stronger than you think," he had told her one night, while she braided a rug from old fabric scraps. "You always have been." One January morning, Catherine woke with a strange sensation in her body, a subtle dizziness, a heaviness in her belly she couldn't attribute to anything concrete. At first she ignored it, concentrating on the daily tasks that kept the cabin functioning like a living organism amid sleeping nature. But when the same sensation returned the following mornings, accompanied by nausea that assailed her at dawn, Catherine began to suspect what it might mean. She said nothing to Thomas, not wanting to awaken hopes that could vanish. She waited, observing her body's signals with the same attention she observed sky changes before a storm. It was Ruth who confirmed her suspicions during a mid-February visit. Snow had given a truce, allowing roads to clear enough for some neighbors to exchange visits, provisions, winter news. "You're expecting," said the older woman without preamble, while they both prepared bread in the kitchen. It wasn't a question. Catherine nodded, feeling a warm blush rise up her cheeks. "I think so," she replied, "but I haven't told Thomas anything yet." Ruth smiled, the wisdom of many lives reflected in her tired eyes. "A child is always a blessing," she affirmed, kneading vigorously, "especially in these lands where life can be so fragile." That night, after Ruth returned to town, Catherine and Thomas sat by the fire as was their custom. Outside, wind had risen again, carrying with it snowflakes that struck windows like small insistent fists. "Thomas," she began, feeling her heart accelerate, "I have something to tell you." He looked up from the knife he was carving, a smaller replica of the female figure Elizabeth had made for Catherine. His eyes, always attentive, settled on her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "We're going to have a child," said Catherine, words coming out in a whisper that seemed inadequate. For the news's magnitude, the knife and wood fell to the floor. Thomas remained motionless, as if fearing any movement might break that moment's spell. Then slowly he knelt in front of her, taking her hands between his with a reverence that made Catherine's eyes fill with tears. "Are you sure?" he asked, voice hoarse with emotion. Catherine nodded. "Ruth confirmed it today. She says the baby will arrive at the end of summer." Thomas rested his forehead against their joined hands in a gesture that seemed almost like a prayer. When he lifted his face, Catherine saw he was crying without shame or restraint. They were tears of joy, gratitude, amazement at the unexpected miracle life offered them. "A child," he murmured, as if words were too big to be pronounced aloud. "Our child." Catherine felt something loosen inside her, a tension she didn't know she had been holding. She had feared in some secret corner of her heart that Thomas might see this pregnancy as a shadow over Elizabeth's memory, as definitive confirmation that life continued without her. Instead, she saw in his eyes only joy, only future, and she understood that the love flourishing between them wasn't a betrayal of the past, but a tribute to it, a testimony that the human heart, even broken, can regenerate, can beat again with the same intensity, can open again to hope. Winter gradually yielded its domain to a timid but persistent spring. Snow began melting, revealing soaked but fertile ground. Small green shoots appeared in unexpected places, like renewal promises. Catherine's body also changed, adapting to the miracle growing inside her. Her belly, previously flat, began rounding softly under dresses she'd had to adapt. Her breasts became more sensitive. Her skin seemed to glow with an inner luminosity Thomas never tired of admiring. "You've never been more beautiful," he told, her caressing her face with reverent fingers. When May arrived, bringing with it the anniversary of Catherine's arrival in Pine Ridge, the community organized a small celebration for the couple. They weren't just celebrating the pregnancy, but the transformation everyone had witnessed, that of a city stranger into a true frontier inhabitant, that of a widower consumed by pain into a man whole again. Ruth Patterson, always the most perceptive, expressed it while serving cake at the gathering held in her house. "There are wounds that never heal completely," she said, with that wisdom born of experience. "But with time, if we're lucky, they become something more. Into scars that remind us not only of what we lost, but also of what we've survived." Catherine, sitting beside Thomas with one hand resting protectively on her increasingly prominent belly, felt the truth of those words resonate within her. Elizabeth's loss had been like an earthquake that had irreversibly altered their lives' landscape. But in the cracks opened by that pain, new possibilities had sprouted, new connections, new life. At the end of August, when fields around Pine Ridge were tinged gold under the late summer sun, Catherine felt the first contractions. Ruth, who had assisted countless births in the community, immediately came to the cabin, bringing herbs, clean bandages, and the quiet confidence of one who has witnessed life's miracle many times. Thomas was banished to the porch, where he paced, tirelessly back and forth, stopping his march only when a particularly sharp cry escaped from the room where his wife fought to bring their child into the world. Labor was long and difficult. Catherine, who thought she knew pain after so many losses, discovered a new dimension of physical suffering. But alongside that pain was something more. A fierce determination, a primal instinct that drove her to continue forward, not to give, up to find within herself strength she didn't know she possessed. At the darkest hour of night, when the full moon rose over the mountains, bathing the world in liquid silver, a sharp and vigorous cry broke the silence. Catherine, exhausted but radiant, contemplated her daughter's face for the first time. A small but strong girl with a tuft of golden hair that immediately reminded her of Elizabeth. "Emily," she whispered, remembering a name they had discussed during long winter nights. Emily Elizabeth Whitaker. When Thomas finally entered the room, with hesitant steps and eyes reddened from contained tears, Catherine saw in his face the reflection of her own emotion. Amazement, gratitude, unconditional love toward that small creature they had created together. "She's perfect," he murmured, taking with infinite delicacy the bundle wrapped in blankets Catherine offered him, "as perfect as her mother." Little Emily opened her eyes then, blue eyes like Colorado's sky, and seemed to look directly at her father. A sob escaped Thomas's throat, a sound containing both joy and pain, both past and future. "Look what we've done," he said, turning toward Catherine with reverence. "Look what we've created together." Catherine, exhausted but at peace, understood. They had completed a circle. A year ago she had arrived at this strange land, carrying the weight of a promise and the pain of a loss. Now that same land was her home, the stage where her own story continued unfolding, in directions she never would have imagined. Life, she understood while watching Thomas gently rock their daughter, wasn't a straight line, but a complex weaving of losses and gains, of endings and beginnings interwoven like threads in an infinite pattern. Elizabeth would always be part of that weaving, a golden thread shining with its own light that had united their destinies in mysterious and unpredictable ways. When dawn began tinting the horizon pink and gold, Catherine Whitaker contemplated her new family and felt a gratitude so profound it seemed to emanate from the earth itself, for the decisions she had made, for the risks she had assumed, for the courage to open her heart when it would have been easier to keep it closed. "I love you," she said simply to Thomas, who continued entranced with the small life he held in his arms. "I love you both." He looked at her then, and in his eyes Catherine saw reflected everything that didn't need to be said. The certainty that, even in the harshest winters, life finds ways to be reborn. That love, when it's true, doesn't diminish when shared but multiplies. That some stories, though they seem to end, are simply taking a new direction, transforming into something different but equally beautiful. And while the new day's light flooded, the room bathing the three of them in its golden radiance, Catherine knew she had found not only a home in these wild mountains, but also a truth many seek their entire lives without discovering, that the greatest courage isn't in denying the past's pain, but in allowing it to integrate into the present, not in forgetting what was lost, but in honoring it by building something new on its foundations. Emily Elizabeth Whitaker, with her golden hair and attentive gaze, was living proof of that truth, a bridge between what was and what would be, between memory and hope, between winter and spring. And while she held her close to her heart, Catherine understood that the past echo wasn't a burden, but a gift, a constant reminder that even the most devastating losses can, with time and love, transform into new beginnings.